last time, everyone, we started in the section entitled No Return to the Law in Galatians chapter 2. Got into that conflict with Peter and Paul, and today we're going to wrap this thing up and finish up this section and all of chapter 2. So let's get started.
You are watching the Beyond Sunday podcast.
Okay, so last time we broke down and kind of shared about the discussion that was going on, and Paul was talking about this confrontation he had with Peter. And so let's really kind of dive in, and now that he's set this up, he's really starting to unpack his message. So let's see what Paul's got to say. So at this point in the back half of chapter 2, Paul really gets on message and is going to start driving into what he wants the Galatians to hear. He's set up the argument. He's explained why he's here. So let's see what he's going at. And he says this, he says, quote, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. So as a Jew, as a follower of Christ, Paul and Peter both knew you couldn't be justified by the law. They both knew that 100%. I don't think there was a part of their heart that was still trying to wrestle that out at all. Peter had watched Jesus really just walk this out. In Matthew 15, he was there when Jesus explained that the defilement comes from within somebody. And he was there when Jesus actually healed and helped the Canaanite woman, a woman who is outside of the family of faith. And she makes this amazing plea talking about that even the dogs eat the scraps from the table, and Jesus praises her great faith. And so Peter has seen these things. He knew that the gospel had nothing to do with the law, that Jesus is willing to meet people where they were. It was by faith that we were saved. And so I don't think there's a part of them that was holding on to this at all. So this is the heart of Paul's message for the rest of the letter. So for anything we unpack from this point on is that he says that it's not by works, but this is by faith. So keep that in mind for any of the rest of the episodes, for any of the rest of the discussion as we go through Galatians. That is the core, the kind of the thesis piece to always keep in mind. That thematic thread is that it is not by works, but it is by faith. That's how we're saved. That's going to be everything going up in here. And Paul is paraphrasing here in this section. He's paraphrasing from Psalm 143 right over in verse 2. So he's paraphrasing this. He says, "For in your sight no one living is righteous." And so no one is. No one says by works, no one by law. That's it's a quote that he's pulling right from Psalm 143, that no one's made safe, no one's made lawful or clean or righteous in their own works. And so Paul is just addressing this entire group publicly. He's letting the Galatians know that this argument about works and all this stuff, this has been done. This has been had. And he said, hey, by the way, looking back a little bit, Peter and I hashed this out, and this was a public deal. He said, this wasn't a private matter for everything that we can see. He says, I was confronting Peter, and I talked with him. And he said, he's basically letting us know, I've already hashed this out. The two of us have talked this through. So this isn't something that's even still up for debate between the two of them. Like, yeah, Peter and I had our first words, and we're still working it out. But, I'm hoping to get some resolution on this. No. We've already had this out, and we've talked this through. Now he's dealing with some shenanigans that people are trying to bring up in the logic. It's always the case, right? You go, well, here's this. Somebody goes, yeah, but what about this? People will try and bring up edge cases. People will try and bring up some new thoughts and things like that. Like they're going to trip you up, like, you probably hadn't thought of this. But Paul is well aware of this, and he's just such a master at logic and seeing through things. So as we believe, as we're going along in our life of faith, we still struggle with sin, right? Things still happen. we are still at war between our flesh and the Spirit of Christ alive in us. So there's still this real legitimate struggle. So if we do, all right, so here's the shenanigans, here's the argument coming in. So if we do, then Jesus must be cool with it, or somehow he promotes it to show off his grace, right? So, Jesus knows that we're going to sin. He's kosher with it, and that's all cool, right? Nope. No, of course not. I mean, this is a false argument. Just because there is the reality that our flesh and our spirit are at war, that doesn't mean that Jesus gives us an absolute pass with it and goes, nah, it's all fine. He doesn't wink and nod and just give a nudge at sin. He can acknowledge that reality, but still not want that. And Paul knows this is dumb. And so he's cutting off the argument before it begins. Before it gets any headway, he's like, I know what you're thinking. I see where you're coming from. I know as you're reading this letter, some of you are already thinking this, so let me just address this right now and get this out in the open. The argument is going to say, hey, we believe in Jesus, but we still sin, so we got to throw in a little extra of our own effort. Wow. This is huge, guys. For me, this is huge. I have lived in this space. I have gone the try-hard mode. It's, because I'm going to feel a lot better in the God equation if, I think, when you look at it like the scales of justice kind of thing, every time I sin, it's like it starts out and it's like, oh, you've been saved by grace. And there's this perfect balanced scale. And you're like, yes, it's so good. And then all of a sudden you sin and boing, that one side just gets weighed down. You're like, oh no, that's no good. And there's a part that knows, hey, I'm still saved by grace, even though there's this negative weight, there's this sin over here. But maybe if I could just help it look better. And so I want to drop some stuff on the good side. Now, I think that as we follow Christ, I think there are good things that flow out of us. I think there is goodness and righteousness that flows because the Holy Spirit empowers us in that way. I totally believe those things. And I know those things are an outgrowth. That is the fruit of the Spirit, which we'll see later on in this book. But I think the wrong way forward is when we get into a try-hard mode that says, I'm going to do these things so that I can balance the scale myself. And I think that argument gets going, and that really leads us into such a false place. And so that's part of what Paul's talking about here, is that people are trying to add some things on, to add kind of a sprinkling of righteousness back in, to kind of tip the scale back on their own, to go, hey, Jesus, you don't have to worry about all this all the time. I fix some of this. But we have to remember Jesus tore all that down. It is a transgression, an actual sin, because what we're saying is, I see Jesus' sacrifice. Check this out, though, but it's not good enough. I mean, we would probably never say that out loud. We would never probably logically get to that argument. But anytime that we sin and we try and rectify it ourselves, when we try and balance the scales, what we're saying in essence is that the atonement of Christ is not enough for me to have forgiveness. I have to add something to myself. And so we're in some ways rejecting God's grace and mercy. Again, guys, I don't think any of us would say that out loud and logic our way there, but that's what our behaviors are showing. We have to remember, it's not our sacrifice. We didn't provide the lamb. God did. This is his sacrifice, and we have to see the value he has placed on it and realize it is worthy enough all by itself, nothing we can add to it. We can't get more right with God than when we accept Christ. There's a great writer, one of my favorite books ever, Watchman Nee, wrote a book called The Normal Christian Life. And, in my life group, we talk about this regularly because I just enjoy the book so much. But Nee talks about the value of the blood of Christ. And he talks about I encourage you to go and read it. It's such a wonderful read. But he talks about there are three different values that come from the blood. Is that there's a Godward value, that it answers the question of wrath. It provides righteousness that God requires, and that only comes from the blood of Christ. It has a value manward towards us because it gives us power over sin. and then it also has power against the enemy because it nullifies any of the enemy's accusations against us. And God views and values the blood that fully, that it does all of those things, and that the only way we can approach the throne of grace is by the blood. There's nothing else. No righteousness of our own. I can't pray warmly enough. I can't do enough good deeds. I can't read the Bible enough. I can't do enough of those things to go, I can checklist my way and I could approach the throne of grace on my own. I can never, ever, ever do that. It's always by the blood alone. And I think that's just so vital for us to realize. We can't add anything to that. And so here's Paul, and he's saying to us that he has died to the law. All that try hard, all the checklisting, everything else, he says, I've died to that. That it does not have power over me. It doesn't have efficacy in my life. It is the blood of Christ that has that. He says the law is still important. And we'll talk about that in, I think, the next chapter is where we'll get to that. He says the law is important. It shows us sin, but Paul says, I don't live by that anymore. He says the law is still alive. I mean, it's out there. It's running around. But the main thing is we can have no confidence in it. We can't have any confidence that it's going to save us, because the only thing that we're going to do is, if we try and follow after that law, we're going to go with that checklisting system. We're going to try and balance those scales on our own. The only thing that it's going to do is enslave us to its measures. We're going to be absolutely enslaved to the rule and the order of law and everything else. But here's the clutch thing. As I said in the last episode, one of my favorite verses is Galatians 2:20. This is the great exchange. And it's basically telling us that we get to live a new life by faith. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me, because I've been crucified in Christ. In his death and his resurrection, I am dead in him and alive new in him. And I have new life in him, in the one who died for me. And if we go backwards, if we go back to the works, then we end up setting aside just the grace of God. And what we have to remember is that salvation is a free gift of God for us. We see this, Paul tells us in a couple different places. In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8, he says, it is by grace you have been saved. In Romans 6:23, we see that it is the free gift of God. And so it is a gift. We can't sit there. I mean, think about that. Imagine if you negotiated and paid for every birthday gift you were ever given. And until you had a full ledger accounting and debits and credits done, you accepted no gift for any occasion, for anything. We would never operate like that. But if we're honest, don't sometimes we approach God in that same way, where we're trying to kind of leverage in earning that gift? And that's not what he wants from us. He wants us just to receive that free gift. And if we really try to earn it and put those works back in, then seriously, we have to square away with the idea that, well, Jesus kind of died for nothing then. I mean, his death would have been pointless and cruel if there was some way that I could have worked my way there. I mean, Jesus said, if this cup can pass from me, Jesus himself is saying, hey, if there was another way, I would totally want to do that. But yet your will be done, Lord, because he knew there wasn't another way. It's just, you're not going to be able to muster through this. We have to do this the hard way, the only way possible, which is him atoning. So if we try and put works on top of this, then Jesus, if that would have worked, then Jesus died for nothing. And I know we don't believe that. But, do our actions sometimes smuggle that kind of little seed of a thought in there? And so Paul, as he's talking through this, really brings a point that I think will bite into us. We have to pause and consider this as a believer. And before we can move on, I think we have to really chew on that idea. Are there things And here in this section, the primary thing is on circumcision, but are there points where we are sitting there and we're trying to add things in, where we're trying to earn our own righteousness, and we can't live in that free gift? Because I think that almost more than anything else spoils that walk of faith for us. And at least for me, let me say that, I think for me, has brought me to a point where I have those hard days. I struggle in that faith because I'm trying to earn it on my own. I'm trying to approach not by the value of the blood as God sees it, but trying to figure out a way to approach on my own. I don't know, something to chew on as we kind of wrap up chapter 2 here and before we step into our very next chapter together. But let's process and think about that some more. And if you have some thoughts, I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, though, take care.
This has been another episode of the Beyond Sunday podcast. And don't forget, like, share, and subscribe.